Okay, so this is a meeting of the Galactic Shaman Astrologers, and we're going to talk about Pluto today. The way I'm going to preface this is that no matter what comes out in this conversation, because Pluto is the great transformer, the alchemist, the death and the rebirth and the transmutation of anything that brings you closer to your soul. What I want people to know is that if you are married to somebody with Pluto conjunct the sun, or you have a relationship in synastry where their Pluto is conjunct your sun, or your partner has Pluto conjunct the ascendant or the North Node, just because this conversation might sound like you've married the god of the underworld, please don't divorce them because of this conversation, okay? So I just want to preface it with that, because the great news about Pluto is that this is how the soul evolves. And Pluto often brings complete transformation through very painful means that are about letting go of old structures. So I want to show you a book that I have kept for many, many years of all my astrology books. This is Pluto by Jeffrey Green, and Jeffrey Green is about the age of a Vietnam veteran. He was in Vietnam, and because of his experiences, his near-death experiences in Vietnam, he started to really open up to, and I would say almost channel, the planet Pluto. And now you all know that I don't really follow channelers, but if you read this book, it is so actually precise with my experience of what Pluto does by house and by sign, that I would recommend that. And it is called The Evolutionary Journey of the Soul. So when you read this, you will start to understand that Pluto is about completing the mission of your soul, perhaps in a more ruthless and alchemical way than any of the other planets. So what I would like to share is, first of all, depending on your own chart, is how much interaction you want to have with Pluto. Because Pluto is really a generational planet. It's about changes that each generation likes to bring in. And it's incredibly generational unless it's conjunct something personal, like the sun, the moon, the North Node, the ascendant, even the South Node, some personal point in your chart, perhaps the midheaven, that makes Pluto more personal to you. And then by house, Jeffrey explains really well. For instance, Pluto in the 12th house is someone who came in to make a complete transformation in the collective unconscious. Whereas Pluto in the first house, that person is trying to completely transform themselves, their own character, everything about their personality, rip off the personality mask. Whereas in the 12th house, which is the other extreme, it's about taking the personality mask off of the collective and rooting up all those unconscious things that nobody wants to have a look at. So depending on where it is in your chart natally, that's what you chose. And let's look at how Pluto would work just by looking at an ephemeris. Okay, so if you follow each year of where Pluto is and how it's aspecting your personal planets, Pluto will also make personal changes for you when it transits a personal planet or point. So if Pluto is coming across your sun or your moon or your Saturn or your ascendant, you're going to have major changes in your life. Also, if it's squaring those points or making oppositions to those points. So we know that Pluto has been making an opposition to the planets in Cancer. So most of my clients right now have a lot of planets in Cancer because they're going, oh my gosh, everything's being ripped away from me. And that's how Pluto works. Now, I've also noticed that Pluto is working in a generational way right now because it's traveling with Saturn. So this morning, actually last night, I had a dream of my father, and it was a very clear dream that he wanted to show me that he had not died, that his body had transformed into another dimension, but that he was still very much alive. So I thought, you know, why am I dreaming about my father? What is it that he wants to show me? And then I dreamed of him again, and he was sitting with me, and I put my hand on his back, and I could feel his soul essence. And I knew that even though he had died when I was a little girl, one of the major lessons that he taught me was my first shamanic journeying, actually, when I was 10 years old, but also that no one dies. So where Pluto is in the sky right now, there is a huge increase in fear of death because Saturn and Pluto are traveling together. And so a lot of my posts are addressing that, like the Armageddon, complete annihilation, the complete alchemy and change of structures. Now, what we want to do is address the shadow and the fear of death, because if we continue to fear it and fight it and push it away, the shadow grows. And in fact, that's then what we have to experience. We have to bring that on. I've also seen a video with Regina Meredith interviewing a man who's talking about dreams. And he said there is a huge increase of anxiety-based Armageddon dreams right now. So it's deep in the subconscious. Pluto works on the unconscious. It works deep down beneath what you think you're displaying on the surface. So the other thing I want to say is that I will share a recording soon, not in this recording, of the event chart of my father's death on August 3rd of 1980 with my own natal chart. And I will show people that that day I had, among many different indicators, Saturn transiting my Pluto, 27 degrees Saturn. Look at August 3rd, 1980, was at 27 degrees Virgo, and it was conjunct my Pluto. And when Saturn and Pluto come together, which is why I'm not making this up, there is long-term death and change. Okay, there is, structures are gonna change. So when I've been posting this since basically January 1st, I'm one of the very few astrologers who are posting this. And thus I have about 5 people liking my stuff at this point. Whereas a year ago when I was posting other things, people were very into it. I am just basically telling the fact, folks, that when Saturn and Pluto come together, because it's physically happened to me, there is a complete change of structures. And sometimes it includes like annihilation and death. And it could be just old structures. It doesn't have to be physical death, okay? But for some people, there's this horror, there's this fear of actual physical death. So I want to get right into Pluto and either what people are feeling right now with Pluto. What do you actually feel in your body? Or what is it transiting in your chart? Or what is your experience with someone who you have in synastry a Pluto conjunction with? Anything that's coming up for you around Pluto, just go ahead and share it right now.
I'll share. Anyone else? Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You're the brave. You
Thumbs up.
embrace Pluto and school.
Oh my gosh. Well, I feel the transformation and the change. I really enjoy it because I feel Pluto with my moon conjunct and my sun. So I like it when it gets rickety because I feel like this is going to change. Something's happening. There's a death. There's a rebirth. I feel quite like meaty about it, and it feels like reality for me because that's what we got to do. And in my body, I feel, yeah, sometimes I feel like my body is dying because it hurts, and I just think, okay, I'm going to do more yoga. But also, it's interesting seeing where I place myself in the shop. I work in a clothes shop. And since being there, at the moment, the whole thing is going through a restructuring. The word they're using is restructuring. And everything is dying. The people are probably going to leave. The clothes haven't, like, we've barely got any new clothes. And it's like a rebirth. You can feel like a huge purge. So for me, it's happening when I open my eyes and look, and I can see it in that correlation. um yeah.
Yeah, Emmeline, your midheaven was touched by one of the eclipses too. So the portal of the career change, in addition to Pluto conjunct your sun and Pluto possibly making oppositions to your career house, if I'm correct.
Yeah, definitely. And that's completely what I'm experiencing. Yeah, because the midheaven is it sort of just went, yeah. And that's what I'm going to the whole restructuring of my this little job is like a mirror of my personal choice to, and with the whole cancer dialogue that we've been having about choosing to be not the doormat, to not be just kind of someone else's slave, but actually choosing now is the time for me to create my own structures. And for me, Pluto is in the second house, so it's like money and self-value, and constantly just feeling like, oh my god, how do I navigate it when I feel so shitty about everything? But it's because it's just like a whole rebirth, I think. um so yeah, it's like painful and then joyful all at once, because you feel empowered but you feel in despair. And I think for me, it's just, I just keep going and I just keep nurturing myself, which is a true cancer, isn't it? It's that true compassion. For myself, though, not trying to just give it for everyone else, but choosing to value myself. And then from the ashes, we create something, the phoenix.
Yeah, so when I actually do the video, when I draw up that event chart of 1980 with my natal chart, we'll see that none of us are victims. That's the other thing about Pluto. So many of my clients are experiencing these same kind of changes, complete death and restructuring. People are, my daughter's store is also closing down. She just found out this week because she is the same midheaven as you, Emmeline. So her store is also closing down. She's going, wow, this, inventory's over. I was the manager of this store. This was a really fabulous outlet for me, and these structures are changing. So depending on where it is for you is how much the structures are changing. If the Pluto is coming across your ascendant by transit, then it really feels like you're dying. Like Emmeline said, that sometimes it feels like an actual physical death and there's pains in the body. So Pluto can feel like that, but imagine if you were born with that. So that's the piece that's interesting to me is, for instance, 3 people in my life give me full knowledge of the Pluto thing. And one is Claude, who has Pluto conjunct the ascendant. And he basically came in with like the complete death wish. Like he wanted to die, and he still very often wants to just get out of here. I can't do this, and I have to die again and again. So he has to be like okay with everything being temporary, because one thing dies and another thing dies and another thing restructures, another thing dies. And my father, who I talked about earlier, was born with Pluto exactly conjunct the North Node in his 10th house of career. So what was interesting with the North Node is he chose a destiny. And I don't want to scare any people out there who have Pluto conjunct North Node. Okay, there were many other things in the chart that I will talk about in a private video that explain what he chose. But because Pluto was conjunct his North Node, he was also absolutely fearless. He signed up to go to Korea. He signed up to be on the front lines in Vietnam. And he was absolutely fearless in death when he actually died. So these are the things that help the soul evolve. And on our planet right now, with Saturn there, it feels like the lead weight of the meaninglessness of all of existence to some extent. Like none of this means anything. So depending on where it is in your chart, that's where you're finding that meaninglessness and the need for complete transformation. So look in your charts and say like, well, geez, where is this happening for me right now? Where is Saturn and Pluto sitting at 21 degrees? Pluto's at 21 degrees Capricorn, and say, where is this complete annihilation and restructuring happening? And I'll hear from the group again. Go ahead.
I can talk about that a little bit. I was hadn't done a lot of the looking exactly into Pluto and how it matched my own natal chart. But I have Pluto at 23 degrees in Libra, my second house. So like Emmeline, and I also have Juno at 22 Libra. So I have a very interesting tension in that spot. But then to look at today and see Pluto at 21 Capricorn, what's that? 120, is that the trining? So Pluto is trining my natal Pluto in Capricorn.
I think it's sextiling, Grant.
Sextiling, okay, it's a 120 out of the 360. Okay.
Am I correct, group?
Isn't it squaring?
Capricorn. Now we have to look at the chart because our brains are like, I think you're right, Emmeline, because you have that natally. Yeah, so I think it's a tension of square, Grant, a tension.
Oh, yeah, that explains it. Okay. Square is that intensity, right? The structures, tension of a birth structure versus a current structure, and instability, and perhaps the death and reinvention of those things. I did have, in some ways, a death of finally letting go of an apartment that I had been renting. That finally wrapped up this week, where I could be checked out and removed from that and fully into this home now, and feeling very grounded and firm here. But I think that too is kind of that other structure literally going away. That hadn't occurred to me until just now, thinking that through. The other thing that seemed interesting to me as you were talking about something crossing the ascendant, and I think it would have been the moon crossing my ascendant in Virgo. So my ascendant is 21 degrees Virgo. The moon is 17 degrees today. We're at noon. That seems, it's sort of that almost a feminine go, a feminine follow your ascendant. Interesting struggles in trying to meet my mom and my sister up here as well. We're trying to coordinate a family gathering, and communication trouble is amazingly difficult right now to try to get everything to line up. So it feels like a lot of tension there in the moon crossing over that ascendant, my natal ascendant. I would be really interested in seeing how Pluto is continuing to move, if it's growing in degrees in Capricorn. I'll have to be watching that a little bit closer. But otherwise, it would be approaching my natal exalted Mars, which sounds like a challenging conjunction, right? I finally had Chiron come off of my natal Mars, and my shoulder is much improved, right? So I kind of have, and I'm finding healing in that, and also not just the healing, but what keeps it healthy. So I start to notice, oh, this is a bad angle, or I'm doing this action that's really going to pull apart that joint again. So it's been a fun journey this year in being more embodied, not just in yoga, but it's sort of all the time, and how my body, how I've pushed my body so hard, it's occasionally been destructive to it.
Grant, what degree is your Mars at?
9.
Okay, well, it's not going to come back that far, but it would have crossed that, not necessarily this year, but it's retrograde right now at 21. And so what everyone should know is that it will move forward again on October 2nd from 21, and it will meet Saturn on January 12th at 22 with the Sun and Mercury. So when I gave that example of my father passing on the day that Saturn was in a transiting conjunction with my natal Pluto, it was a complete death and a restructuring of my life. So if Pluto and Saturn are going to start to move together again this fall, what's happening for everybody is we're in the retrograde period of like the pullback right now, and reviewing all the structures that do not work, that cannot work, that cannot go forward in any such way. And when the exact conjunction happens, I'm expecting that hopefully we let go of enough during this period so that when we get to that period, it's not complete annihilation. It's not complete ruination, because we were willing, we were offering what we could let go, where we could close down the shop or let go of the apartment. This is what I want this conversation to be encouraging everybody out there, is not to be afraid of my posts about Pluto, but to be like, yes, where can I let go right now so we don't have the major collision of Saturn and Pluto and it's really ruthless. This is what I'm encouraging everyone to get into right now. Does anyone else want to jump in right now? Because I can go on and on. I really know Pluto. All right, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going then. All right. So the other thing that you can do by looking back, and some people only think about looking forward, like most of the charts that I do are to find out, somebody's future event plan. But if you look back in your life and you think about when was the biggest, most horrifying crisis of your life, and you remember that date, or you go back in your journal and you're like, oh my gosh, that day in 1979, like, whoa. I mean, I think I'm the oldest person in the group, but if you go back to 1995 and some really bad thing that happened, you can run an event chart for that date and put it in a synastry with your natal chart and say, okay, Pluto was doing that day. Pluto was crossing my moon that day, and so forth. And so then we don't feel like victims. We don't feel like somebody did something to us. It's a huge relief for me also to use the asteroids. And some of you know that the day that my father died in the event chart, Proserpina, who is the name of the maiden from Roman times, which was Persephone, was conjunct my Saturn in my natal chart, which is where my father's asteroid name, Richard, also happens to be. And Pluto was transiting my natal Proserpina in my first house. So Proserpina was there, and Persephone was at my south node. So when you also get into the asteroids that are related to Pluto, which includes Demeter, Persephone, Proserpina, Ceres, which is actually a dwarf planet, but asteroid number 1. When you put those in the chart, also in an event chart, on a day where something really happened, like you were abducted into the underworld, like in that event chart with my father's death, you can see also that you chose that, because after that point of my father dying is when major abuse started to happen in my childhood. And in fact, just before my father died, he had confronted my stepfather to say, you will not be beating my children. And they almost got into a physical fight in the front yard. And so there was this, like, it was almost like he knew that I was going to have a childhood in the underworld and he wanted to stop it. But at the same time, he had chosen to leave and allow me to have that Proserpina underworld experience of my childhood. So it was a very hard call for him. And one of the things that I would say about the people who love you the most is they will give you the worst Pluto treatment of your life. They're the ones who will leave you. They will abandon you. They will die on you. They will leave you to the person who's going to abduct you into the underworld because their soul loves you that much. So that's what I also want to say about Pluto, is that we want to befriend Pluto and not be afraid of those places, because I can tell a very long story about how my soul grew as a great shaman from that point of being 10 years old. Okay, I did my first shamanic journeying. My third eye popped right open at that point because I had to see him in the other world. All right, anyone want to jump in here? Come on, Holly, you say something.
Well, my Pluto is in the 5th house. It's that's the house of creativity, sexuality, children, playing, and it's for me. It's the house of Libra, which is relationships. So where it's had that transformative effect is, in one way it's manifested, is through me having a daughter, a child, and then also through the relationships with her dad. And Libra is sextile to Sagittarius. My daughter was born when Pluto was in Sagittarius. Her Pluto was actually on my descendant. So it's my Pluto, like my daughter coming into the world, has been this like really alchemical changing experience, and not so much in like the physical way, but just in the like all the different circumstances that have happened have really changed me as a person. And at this point, then Pluto, transited up into Capricorn, and it crossed my sun, and then was in a square to my natal, Pluto. They're square in my natal chart, and then I had the Pluto square with Pluto on my sun, and really had to go through a lot of like it was almost like who I was melted down and totally changed. I did a job change, and my marriage ended, and all these different things happened, and it has now transited past that point. I also have one of my prenatal eclipses in Libra, so it is still affecting, is squaring things in Libra for me, but not quite so intensely because they're not those really personal points. But it has definitely been my experience where in Libra, my North Node is in Libra, so my natal Pluto is within like I think maybe, let's see, 10, 16, about 5.5 degrees, which is a little bit of an orb, but it's still pretty close to my North Node. And so throughout my life, it is like always working on that natal North Node point of how am I growing and evolving in this, especially in this area of relationships, and learning how to play and be creative. And I think I should also back up and say that my childhood was in some ways quite kind of strict and conservative and traditional, and it has, although there has been some pain there, it has opened me up in different ways to kind of find some different kinds of beauty in playing. So you kind of have the agony and the ecstasy with those Pluto experiences.
Yeah, the agony and ecstasy is a good term there. Anybody else want to jump in on agony and ecstasy? Tracy, you want to say anything?
Sure, let me figure out. Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, so I also have Pluto natally in the 5th house Libra, like Holly. I also have a sun that is a Sagittarius sun, S-O-N. My child is his sun and Pluto are conjunct in the 7th house. I had early experiences with death, so I've noticed that sometimes people don't have a lot of experience with death of others, or in their life, and I did really young, and that's when I had my first I felt a spiritual experience when my grandmother passed, and I was very close to her. So for me right now, at the age I'm at now, I feel like what death has taught me is acceptance of change. Don't get too attached and to anything or anyone, and even to my own personality or my inner child. Like when I first really started focusing, I guess I've always kind of focused on higher consciousness, you could call it God, source, whatever, and speaking and questioning everything. At first I looked at creatively, talking about Pluto in the 5th house. Well, what did I do when I was a child that I enjoyed or that was natural to me? And so at first I kind of expected that I'll do those things. And I did that, like making meditations, using my voice. And I still like that. But recently what has happened for me is that I've started doing something creatively that I never would have expected of myself or seen as talent, and have enjoyed it. which actually, now that I think about it, I did do that when I was younger with drawing. It's not something I normally would have spent the time to do. And maybe that relates to Saturn in my second house of Cancer. And just finding that space, I guess you could say, to devote the time and just feel, just feel whatever it is that's coming through and allow it. Talk to it, ask it questions. What do my son, my child, that has been a very interesting journey, and he's had a lot of challenges in his life, and now he's 20 years old. So I actually feel a certain level of freedom because he's finally growing up, like with all the challenges that he went through, just being in a negative public school system where they don't, teach you what you really need to learn in life. And so that has me thinking a little bit too about having Pluto in the 5th house of Libra, which I think of as justice and fairness, and how I've just been thinking about Pluto a lot as far as it opening the door to more disclosure, and how the more that overall we really know who we are as multidimensional beings, it's just going to allow greater freedom for everyone, and that's just going to change many of the structures as well. So I don't know, I'm kind of just going off the cuff. Like, lately Pluto just wants me to draw and feel that way.
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. I feel that if we can accept that Pluto allows us greater access to our multidimensionality, so there is no death, to being timeless, because also Saturn rules time and Pluto is the destruction of. So if you're drawing, if you're getting into that timeless space, if you're creating, if you're gardening, and you're not attracted to watching the clock all the time, right? That is part of the Saturn-Pluto transformation too. If you can just get into that creative space and let go. I think Pluto is asking that of us, to not hold on to those old structures, to see what comes through really fearlessly. And Tracy posted something really phenomenal on my Facebook page today, which I encourage everyone to look at, because recently I have been asked to meditate on the Flower of Life pattern. And I've always been really fine with the Flower of Life pattern. In fact, I have a beautiful crystal grid of the Flower of Life pattern upstairs in the wizard room. And Emily knows that. And it's a lovely thing with beautiful crystals with the 4 directions. And recently I was like, I cannot. In fact, it was probably on the 30th of July. My body was vibrating really strongly. I couldn't eat all day. And there was almost like this crashing, no, you will not meditate on the Flower of Life. And I'm going, wow, what is this? Well, I have to just listen to my body and let go of these old structures. It was fine last year. It's not fine now. So Tracy posted something about that the circles that are created from a 13 grid Flower of Life pattern are actually the flower of death. I mean, which after I talked to my friend who is a sacred geometry expert, she explained this completely. Whereas Tracy posted another picture that is the lotus flower of life that looks like it's expanding. And Laura, I don't know if you're on the call, but Laura, who's also geometry expert, looked at the two of them. And all you have to do is look at them. One of them is opening and expanding. And the actual Metatronic flower of life is actually a termination pattern. And when I asked my dear friend, who I also hope to get on a call at some point about this geometry, and it's in the video that I did with Christina and Ignacio yesterday, but basically it was created as a motherhood pattern for the breeder program of our organs turning on to recreate life. The 13 pattern cycles with the moon, so it causes menstruation, and it causes a karmic connection to the Akashic records, so that we have to be reborn and then die, reborn and then die, reborn and then die. So it actually is that what we know as the flower of life is a terminator pattern for the third dimensional construct of time, space, gravity, in which we would be tied to a reincarnation cycle. And that is fascinating to me, because Pluto and Saturn are coming together to even destroy those kind of structures. Like, I cannot meditate on that pattern anymore. It is a structure of our basic geometry that had to do with the third dimension, which caused a breeding motherhood cycle. And according to what Tracy found, it was by an invading race, which when I talked to Christina and Ignacio, there was this knowledge of the Anunnaki kind of creating that for us to create a slave race or a breeder program. And please don't believe me. Again, this is just me at the current understanding. I really don't know, but I have to bring up what I'm feeling in my body and what my body says yes to at this point, and what my body is saying no to at this point. So at this point, I have to say, my body is saying no to that pattern that we're being asked to meditate upon for the next 2 weeks. I can't do it. So I'd love to also hear, anyone can go anywhere with Pluto. Anything that you want to talk about. Is anyone interested in jumping on this topic?
Can I ask, when you say people have been asked to meditate on the flower of life, like who's been asked, or who's asking? I don't understand.
Cobra, who is the person who is just a human like you and I, who could also be fallible and wrong, has asked that everybody for the next 2 weeks be meditating on the flower of life. And he may not know or have the feeling in his body that this is the old, actually artificial construct of our reincarnation terminator pattern that was of service when we were third dimensional and stuck in time space. But well, I'll just say, Moira, you know Moira, because you're probably the only person who knows her, Emily. Moira explained it to me totally, because she's been studying this her whole life, that this was for the Kali Yuga only, that this is not the new multi-dimensional geometry that we are supposed to be realizing. And it just so happens that Moira and her partner are doing a conference right now during this conversation in Chicago on the new geometry that Fudiel has realized with Nassim Haramein, which is a completely different pattern. And Nassim presented it just this week. He calls it the ARK, the ARK. And it's not the flower of life that we know of in the Terminator program that causes us to be stuck in the Akashic records and causes us to rebirth and breed and rebirth and breed and rebirth. So Yeah, and I talked to Christina and Ignacio about this because it's part of the whole sovereignty of Saturn and Pluto. Like, if you feel like that structure is not going to work for you anymore, listen to your body. Okay, that structure's not working for me anymore. What I need to do is draw, color, paint, terminate my job, terminate my whatever, change my structures. Does anyone else want to comment on that or have questions?
That just to look up that flower of life versus the organic flower of life. Yeah, I totally agree with the concept of it's a circular flowing in and flowing out in the organic sense. And you can also see how it would expand again. There's an infiniteness to it, right? It's in geometric terms, it's called a tessellation. You can continue to grow that shape through repeating patterns outward. Whereas, yeah, a more traditional flower of life, the other kind, can't keep growing in that it's bounded. And it's almost a grid. You know, part of our discussions about masculine versus feminine, if a masculine is membranes and rigid lines, separation, dividing up. Yeah, certainly that the older style there in the flower of life would match that with a very grid-like pattern and a very regular repeating pattern there. But also, yeah, it can't grow. It can't tessellate and scale the same way that the other one can. So yeah, thanks for doing that. That's really interesting.
Grant, your words are very what Ignacio said after the call, which Ignacio, I hope you listen to this call because here's another man who used the same words that you did. The lotus one that that Grant is talking about that tessellates, that looks like it'll keep expanding, is very feminine. It allows our infinite expansion. And what Ignacio just said, like he felt, the one was a patriarchal model of containment, that there was a masculinity of holding and structuring and keeping in. And, you know, so it's interesting, Grant, that you just had those same words, really. What else? Does anyone else want to talk about that flower of life stuff or what's coming up with, you know, our new sovereignty and awareness of these structures might not work anymore? All right, I'm going to keep going with Pluto then. Haha. All right. So the other thing that is fascinating about this book, about Pluto and evolution of your soul, is that Pluto is moving through each of your personal houses to make these changes that we've all been talking about. If you're born like Jessica, who's not on the call today, but I talked to Jessica about this, with Pluto in the 12th house, that means Pluto is transiting your first house of self, your childhood, the ruination of your childhood, which also is for me the same, so I know this, the destruction of your character, the taking off of every mask. And according to Demetra, particularly if you have like Persephone and Proserpina in the first house like I do, when Pluto comes through the childhood before the age of 10, these people are usually so traumatized by their childhood and the deep unconscious that it's hard to come out. So Demetra said that with my chart, actually, she's like, it's amazing you came out, Lalita, and that you were not mentally hospitalized for the rest of your life. So when Pluto is in your 12th house, according to Jeffrey Green, these people are natural outcasts because it's coming through their first house when they're under 10 years old. And it's developing that deep psychic trauma of everything that happened to you when you were a little kid. All right. And then wherever Pluto continues through your chart, it always goes back to that deep psychic trauma. So when you are an astrologer, which often makes a great astrologer, actually, you can help other people with their deep psychic traumas because you've been there. You know what it's like to really hurt and have everything ruined in your life. So Pluto is often in service to shamans. Often a shaman will have a very strong Pluto placement like that, where everything else has been ruined. So what else are you going to do? You're then in service all the time. And that's what it says about having Pluto in the 12th house. Anytime that Pluto is in the early houses, like the first or the second house, so some of the group has first and second house, that's also like very personal to you and your self-worth and your values. And what that means is then it's transiting over your personal placements of your third house and your early childhood and your relationship with your siblings, and whether you were an outcast in school, or whether you got along with your siblings, or you felt really weird compared to them. And then as you get older, it will go through your fourth house, wrecking your home and family, taking down your physical structures, taking away your actual property, which is also happening for me. So this is what goes on when Pluto is in the kind of 12th through the 4th house. Those are the personal houses. Do you understand that? Whereas when some of the group has it in the 5th house, those start to be the interpersonal houses. The 5th house is when you have sexuality with someone else, when you have creativity, when you have children, which they are, you know, someone else. So Pluto is then kind of transforming the structures through an interpersonal way. So if you think of Pluto in 5th house, 6th house, 7th house, that is like I'm interrelating with someone else to make the major changes. Do you hear that? And then I know Ken, who's not on the call today because they just moved to Nova Scotia. Ken has, I believe, Pluto conjunct the sun in the 8th house. So in the 8th house, get ready for everything to die and change again and again and again. Okay, like we're gonna rip it away again. And so if Pluto is transiting your 8th house, that's also how it's working. Okay, and I think Holly might have been getting into some of that stuff, right, Holly? Yeah, yeah. And then if you're born with, like, say you're born with Pluto in the career houses of your public occupation, like the 10th or the 11th house, or even the 9th house of higher learning, that's when you yourself are someone who goes out there and transforms other people, okay, or is part of a transformative process, that the career is a transformational career of material or of the public image and so forth. So when I think of some of my clients who have that, like, out there in the world, they're like big transformers in the public's eye. So it's going to be different based on where you were born, what sect of the chart, like in the personal childhood stuff, in the interpersonal. Then the 8th house is more like the dimensions, which is like transpersonal. 9th, 10th, and 11th house is like the public persona out there. So if it's transiting one of those public things, you also might come in and out of public view, or have a profession that is changing a lot of the things that are out there in the community. Okay, do people understand that by where you're born with it and where it starts to move during your lifetime as to how Pluto works on your chart? Because it takes 264 years to get around. If you're born with it in the 12th house, it's probably only going to make it to like the 7th house. Do you see that? Whereas if you're born with it in the 7th house, it's going to be very much your public image and the things out there in the world that Pluto is going to be affecting. Do you see that? Okay, anybody want to talk about how they know Pluto has gone through something? I mean, I'm the oldest one, so I really know what Pluto does, but anyone else who other than Holly, who also talked about like how it hit something, and then that was like ruination.
I realized the other day that Pluto went over most of my personal planets at a young age. I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. I think I was just thinking then about Pluto going through Sagittarius, because I was always an outcast, and I moved countries and all these different sort of family, home, parent splitting kind of things. And also communication, interesting, because Mercury is in Sagittarius for me. I couldn't speak the language for a while because I only spoke French, and then I only spoke English, and then I was transiting. I was just like, what am I speaking right now? And then my reading level was really low, and so I couldn't really read properly until like a proper book until like 11 or 12, because I just was behind. So it's interesting seeing that I was always behind, and like rebirthing myself in these school scenarios and in my locality. And then when I was really young, when it was going over my sun and Venus and moon, I just felt like I lived in hell when I was like 5. I have so many memories of feeling that. So that's interesting. But now I have Pluto going over Saturn, my natal Saturn in Capricorn. So this is just like everything, and time is just huge. Like, but I feel like for me, this whole time thing is starting to click to a point where I've just had enough of it, and I'm starting to just transition and to just feel the timelessness of everything, which is amazing. But I guess the point where I'm grinding my teeth sometimes, because it's just like, that heavy weight of time, and the only reality really is to let go of it and to realize it's all an illusion. So and also boundaries, like boundaries with my own father. Like this year, for the first year, I've actually put up a boundary more with my dad, and I haven't actually seen him, and it felt right to do that, and that was self-assertive, and I'm thankful that he, as a soul, is helping me learn that.
Yeah, so we have talked in this group about the fact that Saturn is the father. And if you follow my posts on Lolita Astrology, there's someone else who has that, like she had to set a boundary with her father, and it was like, she told me what's been going on in her chart, and that he had written her a 5-page letter, and this is all public, it's on, Lolita Astrology, and the 5-page letter was really like a horror scene, and she was going to set a boundary with him and just return the next letter and say, I can't respond to this kind of abuse. Just unopened, just return the letter and say that. So Saturn is very the father figure, and your father is giving you the greatest gift to say, yeah, set a boundary. Just like my father, when Saturn transited my natal Pluto, my father left. He set a boundary. He set a boundary with me. He said, I'm not going to be here for you. That's a boundary. Saturn's a boundary. And this is why when I'm making these posts about get a backbone, lay down the law, set boundaries, learn how to say no, I'm not making it up. I think there's only 2 astrologers, myself and this other person who writes the Chiroptic Journal, who is also being like terribly abused for being honest about Saturn and Pluto, are really saying it like it is. And it's, I basically have clients through tomorrow afternoon, and then I have nobody. Whereas usually I'm booked straight, like a month in advance, like nonstop requests, to the point where I have to turn people that I know are really okay away. And this is because I'm talking about boundaries. So to me, Saturn and Pluto are the ultimate shadow in our society. That ability to say no, the ability to leave a group, the ability to disagree or conflict or say, I'm not responding to that horrible letter. I will not do that. Or in the case of somebody actually leaving you, like my father leaving me and saying, I'm going to another dimension now. Goodbye. That's a boundary. And I think when Saturn and Pluto actually come together in January in Capricorn, which is all about saying no and having boundaries and disciplining oneself and really being rock hard like a goat that can climb that mountain. If you haven't developed some of these skills, which is why I am truly trying to assist everybody by putting my horror posts up about Saturn and Pluto, it's going to hit hard. It's going to hit hard. And that's when Pluto feels like hell, which when Emmeline, I'm sure when Pluto went over your Venus, it was hell, because Pluto went over my Venus and my Sun and my Moon and my Mercury and my Ascendant and my Uranus and my Neptune. It's gone over everything in my whole chart, actually. Okay. When it gets to my Mars, which Grant has already done, I don't know, I might deconstruct altogether. But Pluto can be ruthless if you're not willing to let go. And that's when Pluto really feels like you've been thrown into the abyss and this is hell. This whole planet is hell. Get me off of this planet. Which, I know it's about our multidimensionality, but waiting for the Pleiadians to come and get me off of this planet is also not going to happen, because I am the Pleiadians and I'm here on this planet transforming the structures of this planet. So as much as we can let go of these structures, and as many people who can join in this conversation and really say what it is for them and be authentic, then when these things start going direct, Pluto by October 2nd, it's not going to be quite so horrifying and ruthless. Does anyone want to jump in there?
Yes. Okay, so I was looking back to probably the hardest time in my life, which was after my son was born. I was a single mother, and I had to do everything by myself. Like, I had no support in the physical, that is. And really practically did die. I had time, like, I don't even hardly have any pictures of myself then, because I was 220 pounds. I had psoriasis covering my body. Like, everything genetically that could get stimulated to cause dis-ease happened. And this was around 2001. Not only was there that, I probably had about 10 people that I was close to die. My grandparents died. My best friend died. So having gone through all that taught me a lot, and helped me to realize that I'm not alone, and that maybe, well, it took me a while to learn that there was not a mainstream system, such as the medical system, that was going to heal me or cure me or make me feel better. And I had to experience that. And a lot of people experience that and it traps them. It's a death system. To where they're just, I watched my grandparents, all they did at the end of their lives was sit in front of a TV, go to doctor's appointments, and take prescriptions, which is the case for a lot of people, unfortunately. But I think that's changing, and I believe that it's going to be even more changing, to where all these things, these tools like astrology and more natural methods, instead of like, you know, pharmaceuticals that cause more problems, are going to become more, I mean, they already are. A lot of people already really know about that, but then there's a lot that don't. And I was in my early 20s when I experienced it. So, you know, at one point in my life, I was on probably 20 prescriptions and had probably 10 different diagnoses. And I was looking at, I'm really trying to learn how to get better at relating it to the different charts, like progress charts and solar returns and the transits. And so I'm kind of in this process of, you know, learning without mentally overtaxing myself to the point of forgetting everything. But I feel that was probably an experience with Pluto. And in one of my charts during that year of 2001, it was in the 6th house, which is where I also have Uranus, and they were conjunct. So yeah, I guess it's just been a process of realizing that I'm able to heal myself, and that hopefully one day I'll be able to help others do the same thing. And also, the other thing I was thinking about with Pluto in the natal chart of the 5th house, with the change in for more recently, what has happened is a change in how I view dynamics of relationships between a man and a woman. And you know what, because I'm healing more masculine energy, I feel, and a lot of times some of my relationships I tend to the male carries a lot of the feminine energy. And so it's been interesting to watch myself and see like where there was mind control as far as that whole dynamic and in what is expected in a relationship. So and in particular, that relates to my 4th house, because I think it is in my progress chart that I have Pluto in my 4th house. And so, you know, finally I asked for the strength and the courage and the, you know, and had hope that I would attract the right people to help me, because I have this huge house that, you know, when I bought this house, I had a husband, I had 3 dogs, and I had my son here who had tons of friends. So we needed lots of room. And now it's just me, and I've spent a lot of time in isolation, which has been great because, you know, I had to face every kind of fear always, to transmute that. But, and having to do the things, you know, that you do at a house without having anyone else to consult. Like even having a falling out with my mother this year, and you know, she might be someone who she has a lot of earth energy. I think that's been the biggest challenge for me, is having so much fire and air and bringing it into material. It's been something I've been learning or progressing into. And so, you know, that affects relationships and relationships with myself and with others. And having faith in myself that I can do whatever it is that needs to be done. And, you know, accepting my power, I guess you could say, with that. I kind of lost where I was going with all that. So anyway, that's all I got right now. I'm sure it'll come back to me.
I can totally tie that together, Tracy. Yeah, we'll tie that together and then see how people jump on there. So we heard Tracy talk about when she was having a lot of different diagnoses and illness and psoriasis and prescriptions. And she was quite sure that Pluto was going through her 6th house then. So we would know that when Pluto is transiting your 6th house, that's health and healing. And Pluto makes you, Tracy, you did say this, face your worst fears. Pluto makes you face your worst fears. So if there is something in the body that needs to come up through the 6th house for health and healing, when Pluto's there, it will make you face your worst fears. And that's a really great definition for Pluto, actually, is on the planet right now. There's so many people doing the meditation on the flower of life pattern because they're terrified we're going to have an Armageddon. But they're doing it out of fear, you see? And so Pluto is really like face your worst fear, which is why on the 31st, I wrote the blog around like whether it's an Armageddon or an ascension, we got to face the fear and hold them both in awareness. So Pluto and Saturn really is complete stop, end time. And facing that, like whatever it is, we're indestructible. Whatever it is, like the dream from my father last night, he's not dead. He's still there. I put my hand on his back. And the other thing Tracy was saying that anyone can jump on right now is that Saturn is not only the like external father, it's your inner father. It's your inner masculine. So when Emmeline is saying that she's learning how to say no or set a boundary, that's her inner masculine. Saturn is the internal father that's in your head. And I know Claude has, Saturn is now squaring his natal sun Hephaestus, which Holly was talking about Hephaestus this week when Claude Googled my name and found out that like somebody else's PayPal is connected to my Lilith video and that, you know, a whole bunch of my videos have been hijacked into some other format. And that my our CD is being sold on iTunes, Amazon, and CD Baby, but we don't get any of the profit from that. That's Hephaestus. And it was Claude who was looking, not me. But Saturn is squaring his natal Hephaestus of being this great artist and not really getting credit and trying to please the gods, and the whole Saturn complex of, will I ever be good enough for my father? Will I ever, you know, because Zeus was the father and Hera threw Hephaestus down into the underworld, deep into the ocean, because he was bent or lame or deformed in some way and would never please Zeus. So depending on where the Saturn and Pluto is, also aspecting your personal asteroids, that archetype stuff is coming up strong. Holly, did you want to talk about, I don't want to run out of time, do you want to talk about the event chart at all and what struck you about the Pluto discovery chart?
Sure. So I think, well, astrologically, we often look at that moment when a planet or asteroid becomes known into the public consciousness to kind of get a feel of the character of the planet or asteroid. So knowing that we were going to do this conversation today, I pulled up what is kind of the out there as the event chart for the discovery of Pluto, which happened, I think, the 18th of February in 1930. So I put that into a chart, and sent it out to the group, and I also looked for some asteroids. So we also have to kind of think about this was 1930, so we actually, in astrological times, we have not known about it as a celestial body as long as we have known about the traditional planets through Saturn, which we can see. So one of the interesting things I think about the discovery chart for Pluto is that Pluto itself is in the 12th house of Cancer. So it is kind of in this unconscious place, and it is now becoming conscious, and it is of this coming into the awakening. And its ascendant is Leo. So it's this kind of like coming out there. The moon is in Scorpio, which is this kind of very going down into the emotional depth and digging deep into ourselves. And I think that's one of those things that we associate with Pluto right now, is going into the, that's looking within into those emotional places. And we associate words with Scorpio as like the hidden, the occult, transformation. And so that the event chart for Pluto has that aspect to it. And that moon is roughly opposite Chiron in the event chart. So there's this kind of polarity of those using that emotional digging to feel into the wound. And that Chiron is right at the top of the chart in the 10th house of Taurus for the Pluto event chart. So it's bringing that out into the physical, right out into the world, into the onto Earth, onto the Earth plane. And I think many of us were commenting how in the event chart, Pluto itself is opposite Juno, which is this kind of more feminine, the planet of sacred divine partnerships, of kind of equal energy balance. And here Pluto is opposite that, kind of the place of the yoni, and how does that bring that up in Capricorn. And on the descendant is a cluster of within a few degrees of Black Moon, Lilith, Mercury, and Mars. So, which I also think is a very kind of potent thing. And on the ascendant is Vesta, which is kind of sacred service. Vesta, right smack on the ascendant, opposite Black Moon, Lilith, Mercury, communication of this kind of the dark, sometimes that also that womb space, that creative place, and in Mars, that going with that masculine energy. And then I'm still kind of in a place of feeling it, and I haven't really totally assimilated it, but to me, the chart itself feels very heavy. And I looked at a few of the asteroids. One of them that caught my eye, and I had kind of mentioned, was the Icarus conjunct the Sun. Icarus is the son of an inventor in the Hellenistic times. His father Daedalus built this maze for a king, and then he was entrapped in it, so he wouldn't give away the secrets. So he tried to fly out with these wings with his son, and the son, Icarus, flew too close to the sun, and then the wings melted and he crashed into the ocean, which is this kind of really tragic story of trying to escape, but that technology flew too high, and it led to a tragedy. And to me, reading that, it felt like, okay, you can use your technology, but take the middle road with your technology. So we're thinking, the 1930s, it's right before World War II. Not too long after this, we're going to develop the atomic bomb. This is the time, and that technology is really happening. And when I saw Icarus conjunct the sun, I was thinking, okay, so part of this is this consciousness of learn to take the middle road when you're in these extremes, so that you physically or metaphorically don't crash into the ocean. So I'll leave it up to if anyone else who looked at that chart had any comments or anything that they wanted to say about that.
Yeah, so I hope people are following this. our group is at all different levels with how much people have been able to access the videos and study. You can hear that Holly is really a very gifted astrologer at this point, and so she's really just going with it. I'm following her quite well, so I'm going to just jump in here. What I'm seeing here also with this chart is the asteroid Eros, I think, is conjunct Mars, and that's in Aquarius. We've got the sun in Aquarius, Mercury and Shiva, Lord Shiva, which is what I want to pull out in terms of Mars conjunct Mercury with Eros and Shiva on the kind of natal chart of Pluto. What that's also is telling me, this is like the birth chart of Pluto, is Eros and Mars is like the extreme masculine passion with plasmic like abilities, which we do know that then we developed nuclear technology, which was incredibly plasmic. And then Mercury conjunct Lord Shiva. I mean, what are we going to say except that Pluto is communicating the god of destruction, Lord Shiva. I mean, I'm you know, when Holly found this chart, I was like, this is totally Pluto's birth chart. This is like absolutely with just everything that Holly said, but I also really saw those pieces. And she described so well the moon in Scorpio opposition Chiron at the North Node. Circe is at the moon in Scorpio too. Holly, will you talk about Circe a little bit?
Yeah, Circe or Circe, Kirka, in the Hellenistic mythology, she is kind of like a demigod, not like one of the higher ranking gods, but not exactly one of the regular mortals. But she is a sorceress, and she has her own island, and she's in the prominent kind of position in the story of Odysseus, where Odysseus finds her island and he's lost. He's trying to get back home to his wife Penelope after the Trojan War, so he's kind of there on this like long journey back home, and he gets to her island, and it's, you know, there's this powerful female. She's a magician there, and he sends his kind of crew onto the island, and she turns them into animals. But he doesn't get changed, and he kind of negotiates with her and gets her on his side, and eventually, you know, he has a bit of an adventure with the magical arts of this very sorceress, witch, powerful, magical woman on her island. And so she holds that kind of dark moon energy, in mystery, and is there with the moon in this kind of bottom of the chart, right down in the dark depths, you know, in the fourth house, like that physical home ancestry place. So I don't know if Lolita has any other thoughts on Kirka.
Yeah,
I know about Kirka because Kirka is also conjunct is down there.
I know.
My moon.
That's why I asked you, sweetie. So yeah, well, what I would say is we've also had discussion a little bit that before Pluto, Demeter was the goddess of the underworld. And then Pluto came sometime after that, where the goddess was in charge of death and rebirth. And then Pluto came in as a different patriarchal model at some point later, where it became the god of the underworld. So what I also feel about the sorceress being there at the moon is she's like, don't forget the ancestry of the great mother. Don't forget the magical powers of the great goddess while we hand this over to Pluto for a while to be the destroyer and transformer. That's what I'm seeing there with that. Holly, what do you think?
Yeah, that resonates with me. Yeah, it's in a way, a little bit feels a little bit sublimated because it's down at the bottom of the chart, but it's, it's also illuminated because the moon is there, and the moon is the great feminine luminary of the chart. I also like how Ceres and Jupiter are conjunct in Gemini, which, if in the mythology of the Persephone myth, Ceres is the mother of Persephone, and she has to go to Jupiter a couple of times to negotiate for the release of her daughter. And so I thought it was just really interesting that they were conjunct together in Gemini, kind of like the masculine and the feminine, and they are the parents of as if I recall, they were the parents, or definitely Ceres is the mother, and I was thinking that Jupiter is the father for some reason of Persephone.
That's right.
And so they're there together in Gemini, in the sign of the duality of the 11th house of kind of the collective consciousness and patrons and friends in the outer global community, kind of looking on as this ushering in of this awareness of this Pluto factor.
Yeah, they're the public relation experts and in the global community of Jupiter and Ceres exactly conjunct. This is totally amazing. Actually, we could spend the next 2 hours just talking about this event chart, because this is the birth of Pluto, and that's how accurate astrology is that here are what the planets are saying about Pluto's introduction in the 1930s. I want to just make sure that everyone has felt like Grant, do you want to speak again, or Emmeline, do you want to jump? Go ahead, Grant.
Yeah, I just want to tie up a loose end on that discussion of sort of the end of time topic. Jess and I were having a great chat about this last night, and sort of this concept of timekeeping and how we've evolved more and more precise measurements of time, to the point where we're defining time based on an atomic reaction, or just something extremely minute, a cesium particle vibrating, or just something not at a human level, sort of. It's kind of fascinating to think about. And in some ways too, I see the way patriarchal membrane, patriarchal measuring, cutting up, dividing, the more precise you can measure, the more precise your timekeeping, sort of the more accurate you can be. And in some ways it becomes a level of persecution to cut up things so small, to divide things at such an infinitesimal level. And so in our talk last night, it was kind of this, well, what if the end of time is just the end of this precise time? And I think you kind of started out with that of, what if we quit caring so much about the clock time and start living more in play time or experiential time? And like, oh, that day went by quick, or how is it 3 o'clock? And just kind of, instead of that, live in the moment of time and not decide to keep such a close tab on the timekeeping itself.
Yeah, Grant, you were going to love to hear from Ignacio, actually, who I talked to yesterday, because he had a corporate job, and what he decided was in order for him to function, he had to have sovereignty in all his communications. So if there was an emergency email that he had to respond to, he would not respond until he felt in his body that he was ready to answer that with his sovereignty and integrity.
Oh, of course, that's perfect. Yeah.
As a man, in the corporate world, he would actually play solitaire for a while and go into his creativity and forget time. And then when his body knew what the response was, then he would respond and it was accurate and perfect. But he had to come from his own free will and his playfulness of just playing solitaire for a while on his computer. I know you're going to love it, actually, because that is what you're talking about. He wanted to not be dissected all the time.
There's also a level of fear response in that. You have to reply now. I'm in control of your responses, faster, versus a...
Yeah. Yeah. Emmeline, you want to say anything? Johnny want to say anything? Hi, Johnny.
Um,
Do you want to say anything more?
no, I wasn't really paying attention, sorry.
Yeah. Johnny is in a timeless space. I just thought, oh, that's good.
Claude and Johnny had a great time. They don't care about the rest of our agenda. They just want to be like, hi.
Okay. I was going to say that the time thing is interesting because I gave up one of my jobs working for this Chinese thing, and the name of it is like, it's called like Dad Like the Father. It's called Dada, and I really felt like it was time for it to go because it was gone from me, and that whole thing was run on time. It was really like time. It was like time to the trillionth second. If you were late for a session, if you were 13 seconds late, it was recorded. I was like, this is too much. Like, I just can't deal with this anymore. So I just quit it because it just felt ridiculous. And then I realized it wasn't even getting paid that well anyway. It was all a bit weird. Yes. Time is a bit bizarre. And I was just at this yoga training and we had a timelessness, like, because we didn't use our phones for the whole week. And the only way we knew what the time was when it was the right time, was when this conch seashell was blown. And then we knew we had to go to the dinner place or the next tent or whatever. But we didn't know what time it was. There was never a time. And it was like a vortex of time. And you'd spend 3 hours in this room and you thought you'd been there for an hour. And it was like 8 p.m. and you're like, what? And it was this amazing bath of, we can live in this space of timelessness. And we can be in the right time without checking our watches. It was very freeing.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Emmeline. So who knows what's coming, folks? I'm glad we had this conversation, though, because the more that we can discuss and feel into Pluto and bring up some of the terms around Pluto and be really playful about the natal chart of Pluto. I loved this conversation. It felt like more and more we started to get into the beat, the authenticity of the discussion of Pluto. So I hate to say it, but it's the end of the Zoom call. I won't say the other word. It's just now going to be over. So goodbye, and I thank you all so much for your participation. I do appreciate you taking this moment to share. Okay, bye-bye now.